I was with the Minnesota DNR for 11 years as an invasive species specialist, so the person that issues the permits in the metro area. And then I moved to a statewide restoration position. And then this last year, I moved to the private sector. So now I work for CPRO, which is a manufacturer of some of these tools that I'll be talking about. So folks may say, well, there's inherent bias here. I'm going to be talking about a number of herbicides. Some of them are from CPRO, some are not, but know that these are all tools that are available to you and are effective. With that, Mike, anything you want to say about yourself?
Yeah. So Mike Verhoeven, I currently work at the University of Minnesota in the fisheries systems ecology lab. And as Keegan mentioned, my start to or introduction to the AIS world, especially AIS management, was as an intern sort of in Keegan's office in, I think, 2011, 2012, something like that. Since then, I sort of took a real interest in some of the unknowns of specifically plant management in invasive species. And taking an interest in the unknowns meant that I sort of have started to walk this path of research. And so I did a master's degree, finished in 2018, that focused on outcomes of managing curly leaf pondweed, and I'll talk about some of that today. And then in 2022, finished my PhD, officially becoming a weed doctor. That would be the poorly paid kind of weed doctor, not the ones that are currently Boone in Minnesota. But did that work focusing both on curly leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil management. And I will talk also about that work today. And as Sammy mentioned, currently the bulk of my work is really focused on how a changing climate is affecting our fisheries in the state. So yeah, with that, I have a few quick notes. One is that the timing of our talk, we're going to try to move quickly through our slides so that we have lots of time for question and discussion. And second is a note on the species that we're going to talk about today. And I just wanted to mention that while we will focus primarily on aquatic plants, there are emerging management strategies for some of our invertebrates in the state. For example, zebra mussels have increasingly seen trials for various management strategies. And for some of our fish, for example, common carp, they're actually very well-developed integrated pest management strategies that you can look into if invertebrates or fish are sort of the threat that is of interest to you. Tonight, we're going to kind of focus on plants, and hopefully the concepts that we talk about with respect to plants will broadly apply to all invasive species, but you'll see a bias towards plants in our talk tonight.
We're plant nerds, I guess. Next slide, please, Sammy. So the big three, you all probably know the term AIS, Aquatic Invasive Species. As Mike alluded to, we'll talk about curly leaf pondweed on the far left side, Eurasian water milfoil in the center. And I'll talk real briefly about starry stonewort management in the state, although that is, I would say, an evolving practice and science as well. Curly leaf pondweed has been in Minnesota for 100+ years, so we know quite a bit about managing it, and we've fine-tuned some of the tools for management. In general, our discussion tonight will be on herbicide management. In terms of large-scale management, herbicide management is always the most cost-effective approach, but that doesn't mean that hand removal or other control methods aren't effective, but largely we'll be talking about herbicide management tonight. Eurasian water milfoil in the center, in some 200 to 300+ lakes throughout the state, and then starry stonewort, a new and emerging invasive macroalgae. Next slide, please. So management's complicated. Jeff said not seeing the slides. Are others seeing the slides? Just give me some head nods if you can see our slides. Yes, okay. Sorry, Jeff. So management is complicated. Everyone wants the picture on the left-hand side here, which is a clear lake that supports fishing, recreation, healthy native plants. Healthy native plants are very important to absorb nutrients in lakes. Without healthy plants in lakes, we often have algae-dominated systems. So healthy plants are important, but sometimes, as in the picture on the right, we have an invasive species problem. So in this case, this is a picture of Eurasian water milfoil. So what are some strategies for handling these issues when they present themselves? Next slide, please. So what does effective aquatic invasive species control look like? I wanted to first talk about some terrestrial experiences that I had early on in my career. Next slide. So this really should say buckthorn management and forest restoration. But I bring up this example because largely what Mike and I will be talking about is large-scale population-based management. So trying to control an invasive species beyond just the spot treatment. So if you have a patch of milfoil growing in front of just your dock or your few docks, yes, that is a significant problem, but there's a lot of tools for that. We're really talking about what happens when you have milfoil or that invasive plant at a large scale and you need to do some population control or suppression. So why talk about terrestrials? I think they're easier to understand, and I think we need to start thinking about our lakes with the same lens or a similar lens as to what we view prairie restoration or forest restoration. So what happens when you have an invaded forest? You have a dense understory, in this case, common buckthorn, that outcompetes and shades other native plant shrubs and forbs, flowers. And then you have this overstory canopy, often of oak or aspen woodlands. And over time, that overstory canopy of our native forest is degraded because of the understory of buckthorn. So when we talk about buckthorn management, it's really intensive management. It often involves, if you have a really degraded woodland, a forestry mower coming in and mowing down all of the buckthorn that's there, followed up with a more precise herbicide application. In the center photo there is a backpack application of a stump treatment. That stump treatment might happen over a period of years, where not only the first year where you're trying to tackle all that buckthorn that's been cut or mowed, but you're also trying to tackle resprouts in subsequent years or seedlings that come up. Then it might be followed by either an overseeding of some sort of native plant mix to try to compete with the buckthorn that's sprouting up from the seed bank. You might also incorporate prescribed fire to burn through and control buckthorn. The point is, these systems are well studied, and we also have very proven tools in doing this. But I think we also need to think about restoration of our lakes in similar ways, right? Challenge us to think about lake restoration or invasive species management with a similar lens that we have in terms of the experience of forest prairie restoration. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. One more. So some case studies of success. I'm going to be starting to talk about milfoil management and really at the large scale lake-wide level. Historic tools or herbicides for milfoil control were what we called auxin mimic herbicides. And they were either done at the spot scale, so a small area in front of multiple docks or out in deeper water, or at lake-wide scale. And those early herbicides were 2,4-D and triclopyr. We also in Minnesota early on experimented with fluoridone, another herbicide that has a different mode of action, different way of targeting the plant. Next slide, please. So we had these earlier rates using fluoridone to target milfoil, and we found that they were too high. But if we back them down at this low dose rate of 2 to 4 parts, which is a very small amount, to try to understand how much 2 to 4 parts per billion is, think about a swimming pool. Standard swimming pool is 20,000 gallons. 2 to 4 parts in a standard swimming pool is less than 1 ounce of product. That's how much it would take to treat that pool. So we're talking about very, very low concentrations. These are maintained for 90 days, and the milfoil is basically selected out or removed from these lakes. And I see some folks on right now that are on lakes where we're doing fluoridone applications this year. Generally, you get 2 to 3 years of control, and it's highly effective at targeting both milfoil and the invasive curlew pondweed. A quick term here. It's on the 5th bullet point there. It says adjusting CET can impact outcome. CET is an important term. Mike and I are going to throw a lot of terms at you. Hopefully we can explain them in a concise way. CET is concentration exposure time. What it means is the concentration of the herbicide over the exposure time, the amount that you're exposing the target plant to it, will impact the success of that treatment. So to date, we've got 28 successful lake projects, both for milfoil and curlyleaf in Minnesota. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go through a few successes. Another quick example. Okay, Ryan asked a question, which I will hit on. Another a quick example here. This was the first low-dose fluoridone application we did in Minnesota, and the treatment year was 2016. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the lake and you'll see a bunch of green dots. There's two types of surveys that are done in the lake in terms of invasive species management. The first survey is what we call a delineation or a mapping survey. And it is a meandering survey where you're going in and out of the shoreline to try to figure out where that milfoil bed is. Second type of survey is a point intercept survey, and that's what you're seeing here. It's a grid survey to assess all the plant community in the lake, both native and invasive. The important part about these treatments is we can be selective and target only the invasive plant and leave the native plants. That's the importance of a point intercept survey, is are we doing effective control or is there unacceptable harm to native plants? And Mike will talk some more about native plants as well and their importance. So what I want to really highlight here is we did a fluoridone treatment in 2016. Milfoil was at 60% FOO, which is that small red number on the right. What that means is it's one of the most dominant plants or most abundant, most nuisance plants in a lake. Anytime you see FOO and it's maybe 25 to 65%, it's a really abundant plant, meaning it's prevalent throughout the lake. Now, native plants can also have high FOO or frequency of occurrence, but native plants are treated differently in the state, and rightly so, in terms of protecting water quality. What we see here is we did a fluoridone treatment and we got 7 years of control. Now, finally, they are retreating this lake with sonar, is the trade name for fluoridone in this case. But through that fluoridone application and subsequent spot treatments using Procelicor, when the milfoil would come up, they would target those areas with Procelicor. They got 7 years of control, which is really effective population level suppression of the invasive plant. Next slide, please. A few quick other examples. This just visually is going to show you the same story. You have on the left side a bunch of dots. Those are milfoil dots. And the treatment happened, in this case, is Clear Lake in Washington County. And 2019 was the fluoridone treatment year. And they have technically 5 or 6 years of successive control, because right now they're doing another follow-up fluoridone treatment this year. So again, population level suppression of the invasive plant while preserving the natives for this long period of time. Next slide, please. Coon Lake is a great example, really abundant native plant community in this shallow basin. This is in northern Anoka County. The red is the milfoil, and again, based off this grid survey, we treat the whole lake at this low dose for 90 days. It is measured, so it's a precise dose that is calculated and we'll say calibrated through monitoring data in the water to make sure that we stay in this range. But again, we get multiple years of effective milfoil removal. Native plants oftentimes will increase after that, competition or milfoil is removed from these lakes. Next slide. Our neighbors in Wisconsin have similar data sets. Now, Wisconsin DNR has shifted away from sonar treatments, and they're using Procelicor, a different tool that I'll speak briefly about next. I'm not sure if I can get to explaining why that is, but both states have used these and shown the same effective results. Next slide. So these are roughly 17 lakes across Wisconsin. All of these, you're looking at milfoil populations, and they're going from the treatment year where they're very abundant, being driven down to around 0 for 3+ years, 4+ years of control, and then this rebound. So my question really is that 5+ button on the right side is, how do we increase that control for longer? How do we get longer term results from these treatments? So that's I guess a research or a management question that I'm interested in. Next slide. So I mentioned Procelicor. Oftentimes in Minnesota, what we're seeing after these fluoridone treatments is milfoil may start to pick up in years 2 or 3 following treatment. Procelicor is an improved auxin-mimic herbicide. I mentioned 2,4-D and triclopyr earlier in the talk. Those are earlier auxin-mimic herbicides. Many of you may be familiar with this. This is probably the most effective tool for spot control of milfoil. But again, in Wisconsin, they're using this also as a lake-wide tool. So partial or whole lake control can be achieved. That's not a use pattern that we've seen in Minnesota to date, but it is commonly being used in Wisconsin. It's also a reduced risk aquatic herbicide, which is a classification from the EPA. It has no restrictions on water use, a very sound environmental profile. Next slide, please. This is a quick Procelicor example. So I talked about fluoridone at the lake-wide scale. This was meant to be a spot treatment example, but it also talks, or maybe describes a little bit about concentration exposure time. They treated the black areas in orange on the left-hand side in South Twin Lake in Wisconsin. What they got, though, was lake-wide suppression of milfoil. However, what I would argue or maybe hypothesize is the black areas are going to see areas where you're going to have 3 years of control. So that's going to be the areas where you applied the product and it killed the plants. Throughout the rest of the lake, which is a factor of dissipation, that control might not be as long lasting. And it's a factor of how much product concentration is exposed over a given period of time. Next slide, please. Curly leaf. Many of you know this plant. This is Lake Irene. A resident's raking this stuff up. It can be a very problematic nuisance. In terms of Minnesota DNR, about 150 curleaf permits are issued a year in terms for control, and about 150 more or less permits are issued for milfoil control. So give or take 300, 350 plus lakes are managing these invasives each year. Next slide, please. Common tools for curly leaf control are endothol, which has a long use history and is a very effective systemic herbicide. It can be used just to target curly leaf pondweed. And then in Minnesota, we also have use patterns for spot treatments of curly leaf with both diquat, a contact herbicide, and flumioxacin, or flumi, I'll call it. So diquat and flumi are contact herbicides, meaning whatever they contact, they will control or burn down. So they are not selective. They're good tools, and they can be used selectively if they're applied early before other native plants are growing. Curly leaf is a weird plant, grows under the ice. It's one of the first to take off. So contact herbicides can be used safely if done early. In this case, I'm going to give a quick galleon or panoxylum example of a different tool, a more modern, I would say, herbicide, a newer herbicide that is more selective. When I say selective, targets the curleaf pondweed, leaves the native plants. Next slide, please. So this is Lake Irene. What we're looking at here in the red dots is a meander survey or a delineation. There's curly leaf everywhere, I should say. And over 2 years, through these panoxylum treatments, they were able to drive down the curly leaf population where it was no longer a nuisance. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last bit, we talked at a high level on lake-wide suppression of milfoil and curly leaf with both fluoridone, and then the last product was panoxylum. And then we also talked about Procelicor as a new tool for spot control in terms of milfoil. Starry stonewort is maybe a topic that we could even tackle on a different webinar, but because it's a macroalgae, it's not a vascular plant. Herbicides don't move through this plant and don't effectively or systemically control this plant. So to date, starry stonewort, the best starry stonewort control right now is early detection. So as a lake group or a county LGU, if you do not have an early detection program at public water accesses or marinas, I highly encourage you to start one, because it is the best way to I'd say, control this plant. The best control is defining it early. And then what we've seen in some lakes in central Minnesota near Lake Coronis, where we can find a population early near an access, do hand removal or scuba, followed up with largely chelated copper algicides, and we can suppress those populations and keep them at the public access. Because it's a macroalgae, we don't have the same tools to control starry stonewort by tools I mean herbicides or algicides as we do for the other invasive plants that I mentioned. So again, best tool for starry stonewort at this point is early detection and monitoring for it at your public water accesses. That was a lot. I'm handing it off to you, Mike.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Keegan. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the work that I have done with respect to management outcomes in Minnesota. And I am going to zoom away from case studies and start thinking about, or start talking about, research that I did that focused on looking at the whole of Minnesota's management of these plants and seeing what lakes are accomplishing in that management. An interesting contrast to that, or between what I just mentioned and what Keegan is talking about, is when we think about control trends in the whole of Minnesota, that includes the lakes that you would choose as a case study to show that management is possible, but it also includes all of the failed treatments and places where folks managed or tried to manage and things didn't go as planned. And so you'll see this later in some of my slides. If I kept it in there, there's huge variation when you move away from case studies and towards a whole sort of state of Minnesota trends evaluation. You see huge variation in some places where plant management is working for the things you're trying to do, and some places that it's not. So if you could switch to the next slide, Sammy. All right, so this is kind of busy here, but what I want to focus on first is this sort of central dogma, this little triad in the middle. And this is the idea that when we do management of aquatic plants, specifically with herbicide, but you could use the same sort of conceptual diagram and swap herbicide for mechanical control. When you're doing it in this lake restoration context, there's sort of a few key linkages between that herbicide and invasive and native plant community. The first is that we hope that the herbicide is going to be effective in its control of the invader. That's that dark blue arrow. Second is that we hope the light blue arrow, this idea that by getting rid of the invader, we will relieve the native plants of some of that competition they were feeling from the invader, and we'll get a rebound from those natives. So the dark blue arrow we hope would have a strong negative effect. The herbicide has a negative impact on the invaders, and the invaders, that light blue arrow, would be a negative effect because by getting rid of the invader, we've alleviated that negative impact of invaders on the native plant community. Finally, and this comes back to the question that Ryan Lavelle asked, that black arrow is what we call a non-target effect in the AIS management world. And that's that idea that the herbicide, while in the case of aquatic plants, we have really well-developed chemicals and strategies for application that avoid killing or harming native plant communities, there often are, to some extent, non-target effects. And so if those non-target effects are quite strong, you could have a situation where even though you've relieved the native plants from that invader pressure, they wouldn't rebound because they're feeling strong non-target effects. So my my whole research regime has focused on this little triad and trying to understand how these pieces are affecting each other. The link that I have there, so if you go to the short link, z.umn.edu/Verhoeven G Scholar, it's a link to my Google Scholar page where most of the papers and publications that support the slides I'll show you are open access or openly available, so you can read. Although I will admit it's sometimes quite dense, you can read the actual scientific literature where these pieces of research are published. And you'll find their work on curlyleaf pondweed, Eurasian water milfoil, and starry stonewort that will be particularly relevant to this talk. So, and my email is there. If there's something that you are curious about I talked about and you want more information, or you're looking for a paper that I talked about, you can email me for more info. So next slide. All right, so in my work, one of the things that I did was synthesize sort of all of the, Keegan mentioned point intercept surveys, all these point intercept surveys that were happening across the state. And that was sort of this foundational step towards asking, next slide, what response do these native and invasive plant communities have to herbicide control? And from these surveys, it doesn't really matter how we get it, but we can look at things like both the abundance of the invasive plants and the diversity of native plants in a few different ways. Next slide. So we take those survey data sets and we tie them with about 1,500 managed lake years from 380 lakes across the state. And we start to get this sort of rearward looking data set that shows us what are the plant communities doing, what's the pulse of that plant community, and what's the management activity that's happening in those lakes. So we steer those two together. Next slide. And the result is that we can track these populations and we can track what our management actions have done to affect those populations. So here, what you're seeing in each of these panels is the population of curlyleaf pondweed tracked through time. 0 is 0 prevalence in the lake. 1 is 100% coverage in the lake. And the different colors indicate different seasonality of surveys, which isn't real important, but open and closed circles indicate whether or not these things were managed. So here's a visual picture of it, but next slide. What we actually do is use sort of statistical modeling to ask for Eurasian water milfoil and curlyleaf pondweed. So now looking at this green table, 2 species, M. spicatum is Eurasian water milfoil. Sorry, one time a lake association person asked me, what the hell is a potamogeton? So I had to remember to use common names, but M. spicatum is Eurasian water milfoil. That's the top row. Curlyleaf pondweed, that's the second row there. And what we did is used sort of 4 statistical approaches shown by the different colors here to track what the change in each of these things were when in the first row, Eurasian water milfoil was managed, or in the second row when curlyleaf pondweed was managed. And the long and short of it is that what we see overall is a huge amount of variation. Again, owing to the fact that along with, at the state scale, case study lakes, exemplary cases where we've done a great job, we have a mixed in set of lakes where we're not doing as good of a job with these management strategies. So for both curlyleaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil, the sort of the green box to the far right, what we saw was that the invasive plant was reduced when folks were managing in their lakes. And for Eurasian water milfoil, we actually saw some rebound of the native plant community. So they were sort of enjoying that reprieve from the invader. And for curlyleaf pondweed, we did not see that rebound. And Keegan mentioned the interesting growth cycle of curlyleaf pondweed. What's kind of cool about curlyleaf pondweed is we think the lack of native rebound has nothing to do with a non-target impact of the herbicide. So the herbicides aren't, suppressing the native plant community, but instead it's that curlyleaf pondweed wasn't really bothering the native plants in the first place because curlyleaf pondweed would grow early in the year and then senesce. So overall, big picture here out of this first study, this whole state study, sort of a glance across the whole state, is that we do see that management works to reduce the invasive species. However, there's big variation there. And that in the case of Eurasian water milfoil, we do see some reprieve for those native plants. Next slide. And that is sort of that summary that I just mentioned. So next slide. The final thing that we got out of that study is we realized that our survey work and our management work don't always overlap. In fact, when you want to use sort of the most rigorous statistical approach, you go from some 3,000 surveys or 1,500 managed lake years down to, in the case of Eurasian water milfoil, about 55 cases that we could study, sort of lake lake management examples that we could study. And in the case of curly leaf pondweed, just under 100. All right, so that is to say that we learned some about how we could improve tracking of management and surveying of these plants. But remember, I just said that was like this sort of surface look at, in all the cases where folks were doing all kinds of management, spot treatment, whole lake treatment, etc., what was going on. In this next study that I'll show you, next slide, we zoomed in on the cases where curly leaf pondweed was being managed, and we could connect with a resource management agency that could tell us that they were indeed targeting the whole lake's population of curly leaf pondweed. And in the case of this study, we not only studied how things like the herbicide control strategies implement or affected the plants, but also how environmental conditions like wintertime snow cover would affect the plants. Recall curly leaf pondweed, weird life cycle, grows in the winter. There is increasing evidence that winter snow cover could impact curly leaf pondweed. So next slide. In this study, we zoomed in to a smaller subset of what was there. So shown in gray on this map are the lakes of Minnesota. In maroon are the 700 plus lakes in Minnesota where we know curly leaf pondweed is present. And in gold, thank you, maroon and gold, go Gophers. In gold, you can see the study lakes, which shook out to about 50 lakes with a wide distribution, but a bias towards the metro area. From those, we could study just these cases where curly leaf pondweed was being managed at the whole population level. So these managers are purposely choosing to treat all of the areas in the lake, or most of the areas in the lake where these plants were growing. Next slide. So we looked at three things. The first was that herbicide, that's the jug there that you see. The next was productivity or water clarity and the light availability. And the next going down was those winter conditions. And we evaluated both frequency of occurrence, that's the distribution in the lake, and the mean rake density, or how abundant the plant was in those small areas. Next slide. In this study, I think it's a great example of how these retrospective analyses can really help us learn from what we're doing and can teach us a lot about what to do better in the future. So we found that herbicides were effective both within the year, in the subsequent year, and up to sort of, as you see here in the left panel, 6 years after treatment of repeated consecutive year treatments suppressing curly leaf pondweed. So that left slide shows you something to the tune of 10% reduction per year of consecutive treatments of curly leaf pondweed with herbicide use. And this is a combination of both endothol and then subsequent spot dicot treatments that show up in these. The center panel here, what we found was that curly leaf pondweed is not fond of high light systems. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem here because curly leaf pondweed can also promote algal blooms and algal growth. But even when we accounted for variation among lakes, what we found was that in clearer years, curly leaf pondweed was less abundant in these lakes. So that has this sort of management implication of managing water quality without directly targeting these plants with, removal strategies, whether it's herbicide or mechanical, can actually have sort of this holistic lake positive outcome of reducing the invader. And then finally, an interesting thing that we found was that something to the tune of, sorry, it's in centimeters here, but about 1 inch of increasing snow cover was associated with about a 1% decline in curly leaf pondweed coverage. So looking back across the state over the last 20 years, this curly leaf pondweed study shows when we drill into just the cases where we know folks are doing whole lake population management, we do see that management is quite effective. Next slide. Okay, so I didn't show it, but in the curly leaf pondweed study, we do find that management is wholly effective. But there is a caveat there that we have cases in those data sets where folks will get out to 3 or 4 years of management, and suddenly there's something that happens, and it's once we've accounted for snow cover and water clarity, there's something that happens where you get a boom year of curly-leaf pondweed, which is just a warning to say, I'm in no way suggesting that with herbicide, water clarity, and snow cover, we understand everything about curly-leaf pondweed. Like many invasives, and frankly, many native plants, it feels like we've only scratched the surface on understanding the ecology of these plants. Okay, so from here, we're going to move into sort of the final two sections of our talk, the goals and achievable outcomes, and then we'll end here in a few minutes on sort of what do you do next if you've got those AIS. So next slide, goals and achievable outcomes. So I think a critical thing that we want to relay is that if there is AIS in your region, lake, etc., at the end of your dock, all hope is not lost. Through case studies like Keegan has shown, and that many more case studies from across the region, we know that management works. And from studies like mine, we can also add that results may vary. So preparing in this sort of goal setting context for unexpected outcomes is really important. Some of the keys to success here, one is that not all populations are problematic. I think we could all agree that if Eurasian water milfoil was growing in our lake, you know, one stem of Eurasian water milfoil, every 50 acres, you found one plant, it would sort of not be on anyone's radar as something to manage. And those populations of both curly-leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil do exist. The next, Keegan mentioned with starry stonewort in particular, that early detection and rapid response strategy can sometimes be very important. A great study out of Wisconsin about 5 years ago showed the same for Eurasian water milfoil management, that when populations of Eurasian water milfoil were managed early, they were able to keep them sort of in check, if you will, and keep them at lower abundances in those lakes. We talked a lot tonight about this idea of population level management, and skipping down to the last thing in this list. It's not to say that nuisance management at the end of a dock or at an access site is not useful and a perfectly valid sort of management strategy. But if the goal is sort of AIS population control, then thinking about this as population level management is really critical. With those curly leaf management plots that I showed, where repeated treatments through time reduce the population, we think that the primary way that that's happening is when you control curly leaf early in the year, you stop it from making seed for that year. Side note, they're not actually seeds, they're asexual reproductive structure, but it doesn't matter. You prevent it from setting seed. And so then next year, because it's an annual plant, there's a smaller and smaller population that you can manage. That plays directly into this idea of sort of long-term thinking. In, I think, many AIS sort of contexts, we get very reactive when it shows up in our lake, and we're sort of like, let's pounce on this thing. And there's not much discussion about what the long-term strategy is going to be. To my knowledge, there are not cases where curly leaf pondweed has been eradicated from lakes for any long period of time, and only a few cases where Eurasian water milfoil has been eradicated from a lake, where they've done some kind of treatment that has stuck for a long period of time. As Keegan mentioned, at that 5+ year mark, even with these quite effective herbicide control strategies, you get sometimes huge rebounds of those plants. Okay, real quick, the holistic lake health, that relates to sort of the productivity piece, but it also relates to the native plant community that Keegan mentioned, and thinking about managing these plants with the broader context of lake health. And similarly, thinking about a broader context for who's being engaged in these management efforts. Thinking about whole communities from around the lake, or maybe cities or counties in your region that get a lot of use from the lake, and other partners that might be necessary. For example, on wild rice lakes, often there are folks from far away that will be coming there annually to engage with that lake. And so making sure you've got engagement from all of the people that are involved is important. And then the last thing is that in all of this, sort of stitching through all of these sort of points that we've hopefully relayed, it's really important to have clear goal setting as a lake association, or even as a lake manager or a lake consultant that's trying to set up a plan for managing a lake. It's really important to step back and sort of set goals based on what we talked about tonight and the case studies and sort of professional help we'll talk about in a second here, that are achievable with the tools that we have. If your goal is to eradicate an AIS in your lake, based on the current science and business of managing plants in lakes, it's very unlikely that you're going to accomplish that. Next slide.
Mike, do you mind if I hop in here?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So for you all, as lake association representatives or folks that live on lakes, that care for these lakes, or if you're here as a government entity, where to start, what to read, who to call, what to do next. Next slide, please. Sammy, after we're done here, is going to throw up a kind of a draft lake management plan document. We're not going to get into the specifics of permitting tonight, lake vegetation management plans with the DNR. Treating whole lakes, I should just say, requires a variance from state statute or rule, I should say. So they require either a variance to rule, and that's often in the form of a DNR lake vegetation management plan. We'll leave that for a different discussion. But my point in mentioning that is early coordination with state regulators, your DNR invasive species specialists, on any large project, or any project for that matter, is really important. Sammy's going to share a draft lake management plan template, and it's something that we are still finalizing, but it's meant to be a tool for you to use as a lake association, as a resource. So how do you align your goals as an organization of a lake to meet your management goals? It's in the template that is similar to DNR's lake vegetation management plan. Again, we still need to get it finalized, and also I'd like to run it by DNR, University of Minnesota, other folks, make sure that we're not missing anything. But some resources up here for you, other than that early coordination with your invasive species specialists. You have University of Minnesota Extension and Aquatic Invasive Species detectors. You also have a community of lake management professionals or consultants. Mike has here two web links. The second one is a surveyor of aquatic plants. Those are the consultants that you can lean on for lake management plan assistance. You can also talk to many counties have aquatic invasive species prevention coordinators. They could be resources. So along with early coordination is building those partnerships. And I know many of you know they're important to get these large projects both funded and also approved, because they, as we've shown, require this multi-year effort. Mike has also a few other links at the bottom with MACERC, Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. Mike, do you have anything you want to add there before we dive into questions?
Yeah, the last thing I would say is that we are really lucky to live in a lake where a whole lot of people care a whole awful lot about our lakes and lake health. And so what you'll find, I think, across the state in our AIS in our AIS staff at the DNR, in our lake management lake management professionals, and in the folks at the U of M Extension AIS detectors, you'll find people that are ready to talk about these issues and help discuss your details. The Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center has the AIS detectors program. And within that program is, so if you go to the bottom link here, the AIS management course would be a good follow-on from this webinar, where you can do, I think it's 6-week online course where you learn sort of the full gamut of how AIS management happens in Minnesota. So don't hesitate to lean on the community of people who care a whole awful lot about lakes in Minnesota. You're not alone if that AIS has shown up in your region, or you're not alone in your worry about it.